Welcome to part 3 of today's lecture. As we saw in part 2, one major issue with cyber attacks is that they might not materialize in a very serious form. We've seen there's a big debate about how seriously we should take them. As we've seen, in other words, there might not be just cause for military attack, for a very high level response, economic sanctions, or other coercive forms of response, even potentially a cyber attack in response. But suppose that there is, suppose we bracket that. The question then is whether it's acceptable to use force against the attackers. But one problem here is what's called the attribution problem. This is the fact it can be very difficult to determine who is actually responsible for the attack. You might well use force against those who, in just war theory terms, are not liable, who are morally innocent. In other words, again, using just war theory language, it can be sufficient to ensure that they are sufficiently discriminate, to ensure that you don't violate the jus in bello principles of non-competent immunity. The attribution problem could potentially preclude the permissibility of launching any response to a cyber attack. If one holds that you've got to be certain that those who you are targeting are those that are responsible for the attack, and if you're never fully certain of those who are responsible for the attack, then you can't act. So responding to a cyber attack on this view is always impermissible unless there's very reliable evidence. It's worth noting here that although some of the most sophisticated attacks might require state-backed infrastructure, many cyber attacks might still be conducted by lone individuals or groups. Potentially those criminal gangs or patriotic hackers. The state might not be aware of what's going on or condone the attacks. It would seem unfair, for instance, for the UK to be subject to some highly coercive measures, say worst case scenario war, more likely, or worst case scenario economic sanctions, or more likely a cyber attack against it by another state in response to a single isolated attack by a British hacker. Randall Dipper defends a more permissive line. He argues that you don't need to be certain. He says that you need to make a reliable estimate, be able to make a reliable estimate. And he gives the following example. The commander believes, based on considerable evidence, that an attack on the commander's soil came from a certain building. The commander has taken all reasonable measures to acquire more information about the likely presence of enemy soldiers, as well as the likely absence of civilians. Despite a lack of certainty, not being fully certain, using traditional reasoning about the morality of warfare, the commander is morally justified, Dipper argues, in destroying the building if the overall military objective is sufficiently important. So, for Dipper, morally permissible counterattack concerns the threshold of likelihood, concerns meeting the threshold of being reasonably likely that we can attribute rightly, despite not being certain. He argues furthermore that if you don't respond, you'll send a clear signal that could incentivize future attacks. This is because attackers can hide behind the fact that it's difficult to identify attackers and the knowledge that you won't respond unless fully certain. So, the attribution problem then, difficult to know who's behind cyber attacks. Does this mean that it's impermissible to respond to them? As we've seen, there are different views on this. Let's now look at some of the arguments for cyber warfare. We focus on the problems, some of the issues with cyber war, cyber measures. Let's look at some of the potential arguments in favor of cyber war. First claim is that, in fact, it's highly discriminate, at least compared to several of the other measures that we looked at so far in this module. Cyber measures can sometimes, some think, be very precisely targeted. They can harm particular targets without causing much, if any, harm to others. So consider, again, Stuxnet. and how much harm and devastation or lack of harm this caused. How much harm would have been involved if military operation had been conducted to take out an Iranian nuclear facility. And how much harm has been caused already by comprehensive economic sanctions on Iran, which again has a similar ambition. So the argument then is that cyber war can in fact be far less harmful compared to the other options. That's one argument. The second argument is that it doesn't involve risk to your own soldiers. Recall that when we looked at just war theory, one of the major arguments against going to war is that it involves harms to your own soldiers. Cyber war is obviously risk-free in this regard. Similarly, when we looked at economic sanctions, we saw that one of the potential worries is that there could be counter sanctions against your state. And when we looked at naming and shaming, one of the potential worries is that your state could be subject to retaliation against naming and shaming, again harming your civilians. Cyber war potentially doesn't risk your soldiers, doesn't risk civilians, particularly if you're engaged in a cyber attack and it's not attributed to you. The third argument takes these points further still. It says that cyber war is non-violent. So in week 5, when we looked at all of these measures of non-violent resistance, it suggested that potentially cyber war should be viewed as one of these measures, alongside civilian peacekeeping, alongside civilian defense. It's non-violent is argued in the following way. It doesn't involve military force, and it doesn't involve even significant coercion. It can help with subversion. It might also be used for non-violent ends, such as to delegitimize governments that are illegitimate and firms that are engaged in problematic behavior. So you might see the work, for instance, of hacktivists such as Anonymous as morally legitimate, who have used cyber attacks against authoritarian, brutal groups, rebel groups such as ISIS. In this way, one of the common worries about cyber war might in fact be a strength. It can be undertaken by rightly motivated individuals without the resources necessary to go to war. So one of the worries is motivated by wrongly motivated individuals who wouldn't be able to go to war otherwise can still cause significant disruption. We might think that these individuals are rightly motivated, it can be a positive. Still, it's unclear how much this coheres with the non-violent ethos that we looked at in lecture 5. Part of this depends on how you understand violence and how you understand non-violence. Okay, to make some more headway here, and to make some more headway understanding more generally the arguments for and against engaging in cyber attacks, engaging in other cyber measures, is an important distinction that we can draw, that's made in the regular military between debates about the use of regular military force between offensive and defensive security. And this can be applied to cyber security as well. So in his seminal discussion of this, Robert Jervis, major figure in IR, argues that the essence of defense is keeping the other side out of your territory. A purely defensive weapon is that one can't do this without being able to penetrate the enemy's land. Similarly, Johan Galton, another major figure in IR, in peace theory in particular, argues that offensive-defensive distinction turns on whether military force is used abroad or not. And we can use the same notion to think about cybersecurity. If a measure is offensive or defensive depends on whether it's used beyond the defender's own network. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because commentators often think that defensive measures are potentially justifiable, but offensive ones are the ones that are highly questionable. Okay, to elaborate a bit more, what are the defensive measures for cyber security. Well, some of these you're probably going to be very well aware of already. Firewalls, patch management procedures. So when you upload, when you update your computer in response to, or your phone in response to the latest security update. Antivirus software, limits to administrative privileges, two-factor authentication. These are passive defense measures. They don't really involve you doing much to seek out potential threats. There are also active defense measures, still within your own network, but involve the system seeking out potential threats within this network. They include things such as what are called honeypots, which attract intruders and log their behavior. Tar pits, which slow down malicious traffic. And beacons, which alert the owner to unauthorized entry attempts. So those are defensive measures. As I've said, those are generally far less controversial. As we saw in the first part of today's lecture, the second part of today's lecture, there's some question about whether private firms should be engaged in these defensive measures and how much the state should be involved in them. But by far, the most tricky and vexing ethical issues concern the offensive measures. These go beyond the defender's network. Just as an offensive attack, say, aerial bombing campaign, goes beyond the state's borders. Offensive measures involve some measures that are disruptive, as well as measures that aren't particularly that disruptive or even that intrusive. To give you a few examples, major examples, botnet takedowns. So these disable the systems of infected attackers called botnets. Entering the attacker's network to obtain information about them. This is another option. So you could do this, for instance, by capturing the image through their webcam to try and get some information about who it is that's actually attacking you. Another option is engaging in a rescue mission to recover stolen information. But perhaps the most notorious of the offensive measures, and the one that's received most critical attention, is what's called hacking back. This is where the intention is to disrupt or destroy the defender's networks, rather than simply to defend against the attack. For instance, hacking back to try to retrieve stolen data, hacking back to try to retrieve stolen money. You might think of hacking back as equivalent to dropping bombs on the airfields of those that are attacking you. It's causing quite significant disruption to those that are engaged in cyber measures against you. Now, we might think that hacking back into others' networks is permissible if they're going to attack you. You might think that they are liable to your retaliation because of their plans. In fact, you might even think that a state has got a duty to hack back in order to protect its civilians from attack. Just as the state has got a duty to protect its civilians from attack in kinetic military, when thinking kinetically about military services. That is, when thinking about regular warfare, you might think the state's got a duty, if you're under attack, to go out and bomb airfields, for instance. Interestingly, under the Trump administration, the US has undertaken a far more offensive stance, engaging in these offensive operations far more. You might think that this is in fact required. This is what states ought to be doing, given the potential dangers of cyber attacks from states such as China, Russia, North Korea, and so forth, and non-state actors as well. And in fact, you might think it's acceptable for private firms to hire private security companies specialized in cybersecurity services to provide hacking back services, to engage in hacking back to help defend private assets If these firms can't defend themselves, if they've got legitimate assets and the state's not going to do it or won't do it, can't do it or won't do it, and if defensive measures aren't going to work, you might think that it's permissible for even private firms to engage in hacking back. Yet one problem here is again with the issue of attribution. Remember, it can be very difficult to know who exactly is responsible for a cyber attack. This might mean in just war theory terms that hacking back violates the principle of discrimination. It harms those who are not liable, who haven't in fact done anything wrong. You might, with your hacking back operation, engage in cause a lot of collateral harm. So, for instance, the service that you attack might in fact host important civilian services, such as for hospitals or schools. If you take down the system of botnets, for instance. One major instances of this where Microsoft took down botnets associated with an attack on it from the noip.com services. This resulted in 5 million legitimate users losing access to their domains. So although it stopped the attack, 5 million legitimate users were no longer able to use their domain names. There's a worry then that with hacking back with taking down botnets, for instance, just as with economic sanctions and with regular warfare and some of the other measures that we've looked at in the module, that you can cause harm to those who aren't involved, to those who are innocent. Still, some think that even when harm is caused to innocent parties, this tends to be fairly minor, blocking access to websites, perhaps denying rights to privacy. On the one hand, we've seen that cyber attacks can be hugely destructive, in theory at least, and indiscriminate, but they haven't been so far, at least directly. But there's a broader worry. So even if you aren't concerned so much about collateral harm, and this is that those who are hacked back might retaliate even more strongly and hack back themselves, for instance. We might see then a significant rise in instability if states and private firms engage in widespread hacking back. If the US, for instance, adopts, as it has done, a much more offensive posture, other states, Russia, China, North Korea, other states around the world will also adopt a much more offensive posture and will have much more instances of hacking back globally. At the moment, this is only a potential risk, however. So we've seen then that whether a cyber war and cyber response is permissible depends significantly on whether the operation is defensive or offensive. If it's offensive, then the case for it seems controversial. Just as with war, defensive wars are often viewed as more justified than wars of aggression. So it seems that with cyber war, defensive operations are more permissible than those that are offensive. But this doesn't necessarily close the door on offensive operations. Some people think that humanitarian intervention is offensive. After all, it involves the use of force beyond the state's borders. And as we saw in lecture 1, there's a widespread acceptance that humanitarian intervention can be permissible. Okay, one final point to end today's lecture. Throughout the lecture, I've been using the terms cyber attack, cyber war, cybersecurity interchangeably. Some, however, think it's completely misleading to use the term cyber war. And there are also debates that follow on from that about whether the framework of just war theory should be applied to the cyber domain. These are very interesting questions, raise lots of practical and philosophical ethical issues, and we're going to look at some of these in the seminars. Okay, quick recap. Part 1 of today's lecture, we've looked at some of the major instances of cyber war and the potential ways of categorizing these incidences. Part 2, we've explored some of the issues with whether it's permissible to go to war or use other measures in response to a cyber attack. Part 3, we've explored some of the arguments for cyber measures, key distinction between offensive and defensive operations. This brings to an end today's lecture. Thank you.